So this is a video I've been thinking about making for a little bit now, especially since I have a little bit more experience with the topic, and it's about server racks. So this rack here isn't really like the first server rack I've ever had, but it's the first server rack I've actually used, I guess you could say. And this is an older rack that came with the building I bought. Kind of neat looking. It's missing one of its side panels, and it doesn't have front or back doors. And this is a threaded hole 4-post rack. And initially, what this rack was used for is the previous business's servers and networking equipment. They obviously kept all their servers for reasons I assume are obvious to most people. But yeah, so they kept their servers and they left their patch panels basically, and that was it. So I ended up mounting my rack, mount networking switches and stuff like that in it. And basically this is just a glorified networking rack. But then a friend of mine somehow convinced me I should start learning how to use the servers I have, since I wasn't doing anything with them and wasn't even trying to sell them at the time. So I put in some of these rack shelves, and I think I had like a monitor on this one, and I had my R720 on that shelf. And I tried doing a battery backup, but I didn't realize at the time how the rails I had worked. The previous owners of this rack actually drilled out the holes so they could use the APC rails without knocking out the threaded nuts that are welded into them. Or, well, I guess they're probably not welded. Man, they might be. I think they're tack welded. Basically, there's some nuts for the APC rails that you have to knock out if you want to use them. But yeah, so this was kind of my first rack. And it was okay. But I kind of quickly became annoyed with it once I realized I wanted to put stuff on rails. Because every time I wanted to do something with my R720, I had to like slide it off the shelf and kind of hold it. And that was really annoying. Or just completely remove it altogether and set it on table. And I didn't realize at the time, but I believe the newer Dell rails, you can modify them by taking off a few pieces. So they will fit in a threaded rack. But yeah, so I kind of realized that wasn't for me. I wanted proper square hole rails. So this rack, probably used it for about a year after I moved in. But then it quickly got retired for my next rack, which I'm going to walk over and show you now. So this was my second rack, and it is a 4-post square hole rack with adjustable spacing for the rails. I kind of liked this rack because it had support for these Dell PDUs, but unfortunately my next rack I upgraded to doesn't. And I don't know if I can buy mounting rails like this for my current rack, but that's something I will look into eventually. I don't really use those, or well, I don't really need those too badly, so it was just kind of nice having them installed. But this rack was great. As you can see, it's completely bare right now. I have the side panels for it, obviously, and the front and back doors. I just didn't bother to put them back on after I moved the rack out. Although I really should, because where they are right now is in my way. And this rack was great, but it had its own sets of issues. Mostly the fact that the depth, I'm trying to think which side. I don't know which side was the front or back. I think this side was the back. So the depth wasn't deep enough for some of the rails I had set up. I could have shifted these back a little further and that would have helped a little bit, but the other problem was if I wanted to put the Dell cable management arms on the rails, I think they're going to stick out like beyond. It was, I think it's about like right there, like an inch outside of the back of this basically, which would have interfered with the back door. So the depth of your rack is definitely something important to keep in mind. And That's why this rack got retired, even though I really did like it. It was a nice rack. It was super heavy duty. And one of the biggest things I liked about it, which I could do with my current rack, but it sat flush on the floor. So no chance of like mice getting under there. But yeah, so one of the things obviously you want to watch out for though is the depth of your rack. If you plan on using things like cable management arms, or you have rails that are longer than some of the other rails you have, then you may run into some issues there. And while I'm here, we'll talk about another type of rack I have. This is more of an electronics rack for like home automation or home theater equipment. These typically have threaded holes, which probably won't be able to tell because there's not enough light. There we go. So you see these have threaded holes. I don't think they make square hole variants of these, but also they're not very deep, so you're going to run out of depth if you want to run a server, because the server is probably going to stick out about that far. If you don't mind having it stick out, of course, then these do make great racks, and you can usually pick them up pretty cheap, used, because really the only thing they're good for is AV equipment, networking equipment, and maybe some short depth servers. But beyond that, they're not too useful. So this is my current server rack, and hopefully the last one I buy. And this is an APC branded rack, which the Dell ones are also made by APC as far as I know. And this has been my best rack so far. It's been the most useful because it's basically configured in a way that is compatible with all my Dell parts that I use. And there's a few nice things about this rack. One of them is the split side panels that are easily removable. So I have this one unlocked. Normally I keep them locked just so I can't accidentally bump them and open them up. But if you wanted to maybe do, some cabling through the side or whatever, having a half side panels that's easily removable is really nice. As you can see right now, I don't have any cables going down the side. And depending on what you were planning on doing, it would be kind of tricky with this rack because you'd have to run it around this post. But the other thing that having a removable side panel is nice for is if you're running custom build rails. So a lot of the Dell rails and stuff, they're set at a predetermined size. But this custom build rail here is adjustable for the depth of the rack. And if you're installing that with side panels that are in the way, it's going to make it hard to adjust the rail depth and then tighten those screws. But if you're doing it with a rack with removable side panels, well, you get it mounted in place. You can loosely kind of screw in the front and back. And then once you get this position right, then you just hit the screws from the side. So that's definitely a nice feature to have on racks if you're not running Dell stuff like me. Personally, I kind of prefer to run the Dell stuff just because their rails are really nice. I did have a Supermicro server recently with rails that were square hole, and I will admit that one did go in really nice as well. And same with the Cisco ones. The Cisco ones were perfect depth for how this rack is currently set up. But definitely when you're talking about custom build rails or custom build servers and their rails, having a removable side panel that you can easily take off is fantastic. And I'm definitely spoiled with this half side panel stuff because it's right there. In all honesty, it's probably not something you'll need though, but it's something that's great to have if you can get it. And another thing, as I was talking about before, with the rack, probably should have had my little LED strip hooked up here before recording. There we go. So this has enough depth for these cable management arms. These cable management arms, more light, there we go, have a lot of added space to them. That's probably, boy, that's almost probably 6 inches more depth you need just for that. And these rails in this rack are adjustable. So you see those little like gear teeth looking things? That's what the, or not rails, posts. That's what the posts can be adjusted on. Oh, I didn't realize. I guess these posts do have some slots for cables to go through. So, yeah, so the side panel is not completely useless. So yeah, having the ability to do these cable management arms though has been fantastic because it allows me to pull my servers in and out without having to disconnect anything. And it just makes maintenance that much easier, like when I'm doing video card upgrades, or if I'm feeling crazy and decide that 256 gig of RAM isn't enough and I want to take the next step and go to 0.5 terabyte or more. But yeah, one thing that would be nice that I don't have for this rack would be some sort of like mounted cable management tunnels for these cables to go through. But for the most part, I'm happy with how I have this here. It would be nicer if I had these cables lengthed out to the exact length that I would want them at, but I'm not going to mess with making cables for my rack. That's just not worth my time. I don't care enough about what this looks like. Although I really do like this. Having these cable management arms is a dream. Plus then the indicator lights, since they obscure the blinking lights on the back of the server. It would be kind of nice if these had buttons. That'd be the only other thing. But yeah, having custom built stuff on that's not on like proper rails in your rack can be very annoying. This server actually takes up an extra U of space because I have it set on some APC battery backup rails. So that's kind of something to keep in mind of. One other thing with racks when you're buying one, you want to make sure it has support for a 0U PDU or power strip of some sort. And the nice thing about these APC racks is if you buy the APC PDUs, this just notches in. So there's a little plastic circle at the top and then at the bottom, and you just kind of slide them into these holes. There we go. I had one on this side as well, but it ended up interfering with my cables, so I decided not to use that. But definitely a feature I love. I don't know what I'm going to do with this PDU. It's running 240 volt right now, but I don't have a battery backup that is compatible with my power here, since that's 208. And I'm not going to buy a converter, at least not unless I can find one for a better price. So right now this PDU is running all my non-essential stuff. Test boxes, basically. Things that I don't really care if they lose power. Well, it's also nice with the racks. Most of them should have this, but somewhere to route the cables. This one's a little bit more generous for routing than my old APC, or not my old, it's not my old white server rack. And there's basically these rectangular holes all the way around the top. Some of them are covered up in blanks though, so that's kind of helpful. Another thing I've kind of thought about, which I haven't really come to a conclusion on with these racks, is what to do for additional cooling. And that's kind of tricky, I guess. So having these split doors is kind of good or bad, depending. Oh, binding on something here. What am I? Oh. That might be important. Good thing I didn't force it. So having this split door is nice because I don't have a lot of space in the back here. It's probably 2.5 feet, I'd say. So if I'm standing with my back against the wall, the door just barely clears me if I want to hold like my arms out in front of me. But the problem with this is, and this is more of like an amateur server problem, I guess, than like professional, but one thing I've thought about doing with my rack was mounting like a box fan on the back, just like zip tying it to there, just for additional airflow to circulate that hot air. But that's not something I can do with these split doors. I could push more cool air in the front, but honestly at that point I could just increase the fan speed. So it's kind of tricky with this particular rack because there's not really a good way to get the excess heat out. So ideally, you would either find a rack with top ventilation, this is of course for home lab use, or you'd want to be willing to cut holes in the top for fans. And obviously, I wouldn't recommend doing that with stuff in your rack because you're gonna get metal shavings everywhere. But yeah, so hopefully that's interesting and helpful if you're looking to buy a rack. A lot of this would also pertain to if you're buying a 24U rack, you'd run into the same issues. Although with a 24U rack, you probably wouldn't be able to use a 0U PDU like what I have, because that's a full height. I'm assuming they make half height ones, but that's kind of beyond me there. And kind of trying to decide whether or not you want a 24U rack versus a 42 is going to be kind of tricky. Basically, if it were me, what I would recommend is figure out what you're already using and then plan on an extra 8U worth of space, which is probably a little aggressively generous, but that just kind of gives you the ability to expand. In an ideal world, what really is probably going to happen is with the increased popularity of multi-node servers, you're probably going to end up taking, like in this case, this would be 6U or the server, and you're going to convert this into a single like 2 or 4U or 2 or 4 node server, kind of like this one. And this one's kind of a bad example for my use case because I'm running GPUs in this server and soon to be this server as well. But this is basically for, well, this could probably actually do the same amount of processing power as like 5 of these, even though that's only 4 nodes. So a lot of what you'll see happening is you'll end up, over time, I predict that you'll end up reducing the amount of space you need, because really, if these were all like production servers, I could reduce these into a single 2U 2 or 4 node server and then get like a really sweet 2U storage array. Probably have to get something custom built in that case though, because most of like the Dell stuff, they only fill the front bays. But I'm trying to think, I know there's a few out there where they like double stack the drives. Well, you have front drives and then internal drives, or you'll have front drives and back drives. Some of the Supermicro stuff is like that, but I believe that's only for their larger like 4U solutions. But I could be wrong on that. So yeah, like in my case, if I were to figure out how many U of server rack I would need, I'd probably still be running 2 battery backups. This one is not getting used, so there's 4. This is going to be converted into a 2U server, so 6, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, Yeah, it was 17. So I'd be able to run my stuff in a 24U server, and I'd probably have another 4 or 5U left over. I have some more switches in the back. Although if I was running a shorter server, I'd still probably put those in the back like I have them. But that kind of helps you, I guess, get an idea of how to figure. Honestly, in my rack, if I clean some of this up, like this is 5U of stuff that doesn't belong in here. That's dead. I don't know what to do with that because that has issues. This is just here temporarily for testing purposes. I could probably eliminate another 2U, but that battery backup is going to stay there for now. I don't really have any other use for it, so I don't want to have to move that out. Oops. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of went a little longer on that than I probably should have. Probably would have been a better video to script, but my scripted videos don't do well, so I've been kind of superstitious about that. But yeah, hopefully that gives you some ideas on the whole rack thing, what to go for, what to look for. I know it would have been nice if I would have gone straight to this route personally, but the nice thing about server racks are they do sell well once you get around to it. I haven't gotten around to it, obviously, but I should have no problem selling both of my old racks. I'm just kind of sitting on them for now. But either way, hopefully that was interesting, and thanks for watching.